All right. So today I want to continue. We'll be looking at the reviewing for the next assignment here, which is assignment 318, 3.18. And this one is the looking now at the imagery and the poetic devices in the poem. We're still in the poetic analysis step, um, where we are the last few sessions we go through the poem, we read, make observations of the poem, and then in we did last week, we looked at the parallelism, we sort of reviewed that for the previous assignment, and then this week the next step in the imagery and the poetic analysis is looking at the imagery and the poetic devices. And so I wanted to sort of review that with you because I know with especially the poetic devices, there are several of them, and I think they can be a little difficult at times to recognize. And so I want to just do a short review of those before we look at the assignment together. Okay, so it'll be a little bit of a lecturing format here, just as we review and go through those. But hopefully, this will be helpful as you revisit this for your Proverbs passage. And then we'll do an example from Proverbs chapter 1 like we did last week. But as we start, let's just remember with poetry, there's three key elements. Does anyone remember what those are? What are the three main characteristics of Hebrew poetry? Can anyone name one of them? There was like, right when we
There's
started. Sorry, go ahead, Alan.
terseness, Pastor.
Yeah, terseness is one, right? That means short, right? Pithy um, statements. Anyone think of one of the other two? There's two more.
Parallelism,
Yeah, that we had under the category of structure.
a
So there's
structure, yeah, structure.
parallelism, stanzas, acrostics. So Hebrew poetry has structure to it. Usually it's demonstrated in these three ways. And then lastly,
Um, that one,
imagery. All right.
imagery.
In fact, imagery is the most common characteristic of Hebrew poetry. You'll see it in all Hebrew poetry. This descriptive form of uh, expression that the author, the poet, is creating a picture in our mind. And so imagery is the most common, and then you'll see terseness and structure as well. But imagery will be seen in all the Hebrew poetry that we find. It's the most common element. So here's just a description of what we talked about. Again, one mark of Hebrew poetry is the brevity, it uses a small amount of words, then structure, and then finally imagery. And so we've already looked at the structure. We looked at parallelism in particular, and also the stanzas. We're going to take a look now today at the imagery. Again, this is the major medium or characteristic of Hebrew poetry is pictures. They describe pictures, and those pictures are meant to move our emotions, to draw us in, to make connections as we picture things in our mind. That's what communicates the truth and also the emotional impact behind that truth. So the steps for this assignment are to identify the images first within the poem and how they impact the reader, and then to identify the figurative language in the poem. And this is probably the hardest step for us because it's using a lot of terminology and maybe that we're not used to. And so that's why I want to just quickly review those different types of figurative language. And then lastly, there are other poetic devices that are not figurative, and we want to examine those in the poem. By doing this, looking for these things in the poem, we not only become more familiar with the poem, but we're also analyzing how the author is using these different devices to communicate his the principles of what he's trying to teach in that. And so this is uh, what we want to focus our attention on. Okay. So with that being said, let's consider, one second here, the imagery. All right. And when we're doing imagery in this step, what you're trying to do is just identify the images in the poem. That is, as you read through the poem, are there any pictures that the poet is describing? Um, what image does he describe? For example, Psalm 23. All right, classic psalm. Jay, you want to read this one? Just the first three verses here. Psalm 23.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside in quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake.
All right, thank you. So notice here there's an image being pictured or being described, right? He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He guides me in the paths of righteousness. And then the Lord is my shepherd. And so what's the image here he's describing? We are, if the Lord's the shepherd and we are the sheep. And this image here is of the shepherd guiding, providing, protecting, feeding, caring for the sheep. That's the image, right? And so you can almost picture it: green pastures, quiet waters, guides me in the paths of righteousness. And so this idea of being led as a sheep by the shepherd to a place where there's uh, provision, water, food, protection. All right. And then at the end of the psalm, right, he says, "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." And so again, this image of a shepherd guiding, directing, protecting his sheep. All right, so that's the image. And then we want to think about, once we identify the image, sometimes there'll just be one image in part of the poem. Other times there may be several images described in the poem. And so you won't necessarily find an image in every verse. And like I said, sometimes there'll be an image described over a few verses, like we see here. But the key is just trying to see what picture is the author describing or developing here. All right. And again, here's the Lord as the shepherd and we are the sheep. And this picture of care, provision, protection is being described. All right. And then we want to ask, okay, what emotions does each image convey? And how would they impact the original audience? What would their understanding be? And I think here in this culture, right, they're very familiar with sheep and shepherds and the need for sheep to be protected and cared for because they're pretty dumb and they're wild animals, bears, lions, dogs that would attack. And so this image would convey in that culture this idea of we are like sheep, we are vulnerable, we need protection, we need care, and the Lord providing that. And so that would be the thing you'd want to describe. As you identify the image, you also want to describe how would that image affect the original audience? How would they have understood that picture? Okay. I think I gave an example in class in Psalm 129, or sorry, 128. It was describing is it 128? The picture of the man is home. It said that the blessed man, his wife is like a fruitful vine in his house, his children like olive plants around his table. And that's an image. It's a picture of the wife being like a grapevine and the children like these olive tree shoots coming up out of the ground. And so we'd want to say that that's the picture described, and then we want to understand how would the original audience have understood that picture? And sometimes we may not know, so we'd have to look at other places in the Bible to see what is the uh, what is portrayed about those particular images, like the fruitful vine in Psalm 128. We want to look at other passages that describe a fruitful vine and see what they have to say. All right. And so sometimes an image may not be clear as to how that would affect the original audience. Again, not how it would affect us, but first, how would it affect or impact the audience to which the poem is first being written? Okay. So that's the first part of this, is to identify the images and then how they would affect the original audience. What would be the impact? And then secondly, the second step is to identify the poetic devices, the figures of speech, and then the other devices. So figures of speech, the figurative language. Um, we see a lot of this all over the Bible, but especially in the poetic genre. All right. And the difference between literal and figurative, when something is literal, that just means that the definition of the word is what it's describing. So, like for example, in Psalm 23, it says, "The Lord is my shepherd." Well, God is not an actual shepherd. He's not literally a shepherd of sheep. And so there it's figurative because we know it's not meant literally. Um, and so we really looking for, when something is literal, then the words that are used will follow the dictionary meaning assigned to the word. But figurative language won't do that. It has another meaning intended by the author that is not follow the exact definition of the words. Uh, and I will show some examples of that. All right, again, Psalm 23. David was not saying Yahweh is a shepherd and that we are sheep, but he's describing how God is like a shepherd and we are like his sheep and how he treats us. All right, so the poet understands he's not claiming that we're sheep and he's the shepherd, but he knows from that picture, though, that literal picture of shepherd and sheep, that when he describes God this way, it it gives us an idea, a message, a principle. All right. And so it's describing, the author has literal truth that he intends to teach, but he uses figurative language sometimes to do that. All right. Any questions on that?
None so far, Pastor.
Okay. Because as we go through, and as you're going through a poem and you kind of read a verse, then you have to ask yourself, does this seem to be literal? Like what the words are here, is that what they literally mean? Or is the author using them in a figurative way? That there is a truth he is teaching us or expressing, but he's doing it in a figurative way rather than a literal way. All right, we'll go through some examples. We covered these in class. There are several different figures of speech. We didn't cover every figure of speech. I tried to just identify the more common ones. There are some scholars, some Old Testament scholars that have, I think, identified 30 or 40 or more figures of speech in the Bible. And well, that's too many to try to remember. So I just focused us on the ones that are more commonly used. And I think the most commonly used is comparison. In fact, we just saw a comparison in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. That's a comparison. He's not a literal shepherd. But he's comparing. There's things that God does that are like a shepherd does for the sheep. There are things God does for us that are like what a shepherd does for sheep. And that's the truth that he wants to convey. And he could have said that. He could have just said, the Lord takes care of us and protects us. He provides for our needs. Okay, the author could have just said that. David could have just said it that way. But instead, he wanted to describe a picture because that can have a more powerful impact, can affect us more in a stronger way. Because because we know how a shepherd protects and provides for the sheep, and so in doing that, it adds more, uh, like I said, more emotion. It's more picturesque. It's a more beautiful way to express the truth. And so he uses a comparison. Now, we have three types of comparisons. They're a different strength of comparison. The least direct comparison is the simile. That's when you see the word like, right? Uh, Psalm 1, he will be like a tree firmly planted. So it's comparing, but it's not the strongest comparison. A metaphor is a little more direct, like the Lord is my shepherd. He didn't say the Lord is like my shepherd. He said the Lord is my shepherd. So that's a stronger comparison. And then the strongest is that fancy word we learned, hypocatastasis. Um, so, for example, and I just use this, he will be like a tree firmly planted. That's a simile. Okay, that's the least direct form of comparison. The Lord is my shepherd. That's a metaphor. That's a stronger form of comparison. And then this last one is hypocatastasis, where notice he doesn't use the hypocatastasis. He doesn't use the term like or is. He just says, dogs have encompassed me, or dogs encompass me. And as you read through the psalm, you realize he didn't mean that literally. He didn't mean actual dogs were surrounding him. He was using this as an expression to describe his enemies. And he didn't say, my enemies are like dogs who surround me. He didn't say, my enemies are dogs who surround me. He says, my dogs surround me or encompass me. Right? So it's a strongest comparison. For example, yeah, I just gave this, right? If he had said this as a simile, he would have said, they are like dogs who encompass me, or a metaphor, they are dogs who encompass me. Okay, so that's the difference. Um, Trying to think of another example, hypocatastasis. Oh, maybe one will come to mind. Okay, so those are the figures of speech that are comparisons, simile, metaphor, hypocatastasis. Now, there are also figures of speech that are referred to as attributing features, and that means that a like personification is a human feature or characteristic that is applied to a non-human object, like the trees of the forest. Uh, Clap their hands. Right here's an example. Let the rivers clap their hands. Let the mountains sing together for joy. Well, mountains don't sing. People sing. Rivers don't have hands that clap. People do. So this is figurative, but it's called a personification. Now, when we apply a human characteristic to God, that is called an anthropomorphism. Anthropos, man. Morphism, form of a man. So God doesn't have physical features, but there are many passages in the Bible that describe him like having that. So, for example, the eye of the Lord. Well, God doesn't have an eye, physical eye. Yes, I know. The Son of God, when he became man, had an eye, but as we look at Psalm 33, he's describing here Yahweh, who Jesus said, God the Father is right? God is spirit. Um, and so the eye of the Lord wasn't a physical, literal eye, but we know what an eye does. And so when it says the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, we know he's describing this idea of God sees or he recognizes, he knows who those are who fear him. Even to say God sees. I mean, God doesn't have an eye that processes images and, takes them to the brain. And God doesn't have those organs to do that. But we understand the idea when he says God sees everything. Um, we know what that means, but it's a figurative way. It's called an anthropomorphism. And then there's thirdly a zoomorphism, which is an animal characteristic being describing God. So speaking of God, he will cover you with his pinions, right? With his wings. Under his wings you may seek refuge. Well, God doesn't have pinions or wings, but we understand it's a figurative way to express protection, right? Chicks running under the wings of their mother. And so again, there's a literal truth here, but it's being expressed in a figurative way. God will protect us, like a bird protects its young under its wings. Okay? So these are what we call attributing features: personification, anthropomorphism, and zoomorphism. All right? And if you guys have questions, just interrupt me as I go through these to review, okay? Another type of figurative language is called substitution. There's another category. So we have the category of comparison, simile, metaphor, hypocatastasis. We have the category of attributing human features either to a non-human object, personification, human features attributed to God, anthropomorphism, or animal features attributed to God, zoomorphism. Here we have substitution. That is, there are different ways where certain word or words are meant to be a substitute for their literal meaning. So, for example, metonymy, one thing representing another. So, for example, Psalm 10, his mouth is full of curses. His tongue is mischief under his tongue. Well, curses aren't a literal thing that you can put in your mouth like a balut or something like that, or durian. That's something you can put in your mouth to eat. Well, curses you don't put in your mouth to eat, but this expression, his mouth is full of curses. We can see that image, right? It's like he's speaking so many curses. It's like his mouth is full. Or under his tongue is mischief. Well, mischief is not a physical object that can be under our tongue, but it's a figurative way to express by his words what he says. He's creating mischief or he's carrying out wickedness. So it's a figurative expression. We call it a metonymy. The mouth represents the whole body that is doing that. Or sorry, the mouth, excuse me, is representing something else. Now, if we want a part of something to represent the whole thing, that's called a synecdoche. For example, uh, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers. And we actually see two figures of speech in that one statement. One, finger. God doesn't have fingers, so that's an anthropomorphism. But then when he says the work of your fingers, he's speaking of the finger kind of representing the whole power of God. And that he creates from himself. And so finger is like a part of the whole. All right. So sometimes we might have the expression the heart of the matter. That's like the central part that represents the whole thing. All right. Another form of substitution is called euphemism. That's when sometimes there are more graphic or blunt or maybe even offensive words that if we don't want to say it in the graphic way, we'll use another word. For example, in Genesis 3, when it says Cain knew his wife, Eve, well, it wasn't there talking about knowledge, it was talking about intimacy. Um, So sometimes that word to know is used instead of saying they were intimate or had a sexual relationship. They might say knew, he knew her. Or another one is asleep. Like when Jesus said of Tabitha, she had fallen asleep when actually she had died. And so that was a euphemism. Or Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11 that some who have taken the Lord's Supper wrongly have fallen asleep. Well, he didn't mean they took a nap. He meant they had died. So those are called a euphemism. Again, that's a word or phrase used that's not as graphic or strong or as blunt as the word that it represents. And finally, idiom. Idioms are very common, and it's a word or group of words that mean something completely different than the statement. So, for example, um, in Psalm 3, you have smitten all my enemies on the cheek. You've shattered the teeth of the wicked. Well, that didn't mean like a giant fist coming out of the sky, punching the enemies in the mouth and breaking all their teeth. That would be the literal meaning, but that's not what he's saying here. This is an idiom. Shattering the teeth of the wicked is like, humiliation and defeat, like punching someone in the mouth, breaking all of his teeth. So that's an idiom, an expression that the meaning of the words together uh, is not literal. This sentence is not meant literally, but it does express a literal truth that God has humiliated, defeated um, our enemies. Sometimes we might use the expression, he punched me in the gut. Uh, in English, that means to be punched in the stomach. But we may not mean it that way. It may mean like you said or did something that really hurt me, like being hit in the stomach. And so that's called again an idiom. It's a statement, a phrase, or a clause, a group of words that don't mean follow the definition of each of the words. Okay. Then there's another type of figure of speech called hyperbole. This is just simply exaggeration. My tears have been my food day and night. That's an exaggeration. David wasn't speaking, or the psalmist here wasn't speaking of that all he ate was tears and that he did so all day and all night. He's saying this figuratively to express he's exaggerating in order to convey the strength, the power of this emotion, that he's filled with grief. Um, while they say to me all day long, where is your God? Now, I don't think that's literal. I don't think that um, his tears, for one, they don't speak, so that's an anthropomorphism, but also it's not happening all day long, 24 hours, every second, every minute, every hour of the day. But he's again just emphasizing, he's using hyperbole to describe how it feels. It feels like it's happening all the time. Okay, so that's hyperbole. And irony. And these are ironies probably one of the more difficult ones to see, where the author intentionally means something different or opposite to what he says. Like when Job told his friends after they counseled him and told him he was doing something evil and it was his fault. And he says, no doubt you are the people and wisdom will die with you. And what he means by that is, you guys are so wise and so smart. You know everything that when you die, then all that knowledge will be gone. Well, he's really being sarcastic with them if you read the context, the rest of the verses around that. So that was an irony. He didn't mean what he said. He actually meant the opposite. All right. Wordplay. This also is a difficult one to find because the wordplay will be in the original language, and sometimes the translation, the English or the Cebuano translation, won't capture the idiom or the pun. So, like I gave an example from Micah 1 where we had these names of cities and towns that were going to be defeated by the Assyrians. And unless you know the name of the town, like here, Beth Ephra means house of dust. And he said, at Beth Ephra, roll yourself in the dust. So he's making a statement related to the name of the town to express how they were going to be destroyed, defeated by the Assyrians. So word plays are often hard to spot in the text, but sometimes the translator will put a footnote or something there, and it'll show you that there's a play on words happening. And then I think finally it's the last one, merism. A merism is communicates, it emphasizes the wholeness of the situation or what's happening, the totality of it by using often two contrasting words. My tears have been my food day and night. Okay, that's a merism. The heavens and the earth, right? From east to west. All right, so it's kind of expressing the opposites or repetition to express the whole, the totality of something that's happening. Um, Psalm 1, he shall meditate on his law day and night. All right, again, that's a merism to express the totality, the wholeness of it. All right. Okay. Questions on figurative devices. We'll look at the Proverbs 1 in a moment to see the examples, but
Pastor Tim,
yes.
um, there is a little bit confusion between the hyperbole and reason. Because if you see, my tears have been my food day and night. Sometimes we look at it like a hyperbole.
Yeah. And there's two things going on here. So that's a great question, a great observation. So what we have here is two things. We have the hyperbole because he's saying his tears have been his food day and night. Okay, that's an exaggeration. Um, right? He's trying to say, um, I am in right deep grief and sorrow, right? But he's also using a merism to convey that hyperbole. He could have said, "My tears have been my food all the time, all the day," and that would just have been hyperbole, right? If he had said, "My tears have been my food all day," all right, that would just be hyperbole. Okay, hyperbole only. But when he says, they've been my food day and night, now he's added merism on that as well. Okay, so both are happening here. But if we add
So the
something,
keyword,
go
the
ahead.
keyword there, Pastor Tim, is the phrase day and night, which
Yes, that's the
communicates
merism.
totality.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so that's
Okay,
the
A
thank you.
merism.
contrasting phrase, Pastor, no? A contrasting phrase. Day and night like that.
Yeah, they contrast each other. So he's like saying all day, all night. So all of it. Um, Like same thing in Psalm 1:3 says, in his law he meditates, that is the righteous man. All right, now here he meditates in his law. This part's literal. Okay, but day and night, there's my merism. He's not saying that the guy never eats or sleeps or talks to anyone. All he's doing all day, all night is meditating. All right, but he's expressing the importance of it and sort of the, like pray without ceasing, right? Now that's not a merism, but it's also, but if Paul had said pray day and night, that would be called a merism. Right? So you're looking for, or there's a day to day, I think this is in Psalm 19, pours forth speech. Night to night reveals, I forget what he said, understanding, something like that. These would be a merism. Notice day to day and night to night. That's a merism. All right, or I forget, I think in Isaiah he says, my glory fills the heavens and the earth. He could just say my glory's in all the universe, but he uses a merism here, heavens and earth, to just emphasize the totality of it. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes, Pastor.
Yeah, I hope so. All right. Great observation. So yeah, we have in that psalm, my tears have been my food day and night. We have two figures of speech going on there. Okay, now there are other poetic devices that are commonly used in poetry but are not figurative. For example, a refrain. That's like a chorus in a song, repeating a phrase or a clause. Psalm 46 repeats this in two verses. Yahweh of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Repeats that in verse 7 and then again in verse 9. Psalm 136, is it? I think, which says, the loving kindness of the Lord is everlasting. And then it repeats it like every verse. That would be a refrain. Okay. Repetition. Now, this is where a particular word or phrase is repeated throughout the psalm, not as a refrain, but just by way of repetition. So, what do we see repeated here? Let's see. Nigel, if you could read these four verses here for us.
All right. Morning, Pastor Tim.
Good morning.
Psalm 24, 7 to 10. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory.
All right, good. So, what do we see here being repeated? What are some repeated words or synonyms even?
Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, in
Okay, and
verses 7 and 9.
that might be a refrain even because it's a whole verse. He even repeats again, who is the King of glory? So that we get some actual full verses being repeated. What about particular words?
Yeah. How about this? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle in
Okay,
verse
good.
8.
So we have strong, mighty, mighty, even glory in a sense can be connected to that. All right, good.
Gates and doors.
Yeah, good. Gates, doors, which again he repeats. Gates, doors. How about king? King, 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 king. A lot of repetition here. Anyone see anything else?
Heads.
Heads, yeah, okay. Heads, heads. I guess I'll do that one. Even Yahweh, right? The Lord. Lord. All right, so It's a lot of repetition going on here. And that conveys, emphasis, focus, um, here. And then even as Nigel pointed out, we can see even the entire verses being repeated here, entire statements as well. Okay. So repetition, very, very, very common uh, device used in poetry. It's really used in many different types, genres in the Bible, but especially poetry. Okay. Now, another type of poetic device that's, again, not figurative. It's called direct address or apostrophe. All right. It's really just a direct address. Someone being addressed, like the statement is being directly addressed to somebody. So, for example, in Psalm 24, lift up your head, O gates. Be lifted up, O ancient doors. So it's like he's speaking to the gates. He's speaking to the doors. Should, by the way, be an anthropomorphism, right? Or sorry, personification. Gates don't have heads to lift up. Doors, right, don't lift themselves up. So that's a personification. But also, it's a direct address. O gates, O ancient doors. All right. So when you see that in a poem, like for example in Proverbs, we often see that my son or my sons. Right. That's direct address. That's apostrophe. All right. Or we might see an interjection. That's another poetic device where a particular word or phrase is inserted. It's not necessarily needed to understand what's being said, but it's an emphatic statement. So, behold, it's a very common one, or indeed, or certainly. Those would be some common interjections. Whoa, be another one. All right, that's often inserted to give emphasis, emotion, or focus. Like, hey, like it's saying, like, hey, listen to what I'm going to say. It's the idea sometimes. Another poetic device is what we call ellipsis. We talked about that when we looked at parallelism. Again, that's where a word or a phrase is not explicitly written, but it's assumed to be there. So, for example, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. The world, and notice it doesn't say is the Lord's, but that's what's implied, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. If it just said the world and those who dwell in it, the world what? Well, obviously, the world, he's just following what he said in the first line. The world is the Lord's. But he doesn't put it in because then it would kind of be redundant or repetitive in a way that he doesn't want. So, again, to be terse, he just says the world and those who dwell in it. Okay? That's ellipsis. Now, inclusio, this one's a little bit tougher to see because it is looks like a refrain because it'll be a statement, a verse that's repeated, but it has a different function than a refrain. A refrain usually ends the stanza, but an inclusio comes at the beginning and the end of a stanza, like a book, like on a bookshelf where you have bookends to hold the books together. Well, that's what an inclusio does. It focuses on, it makes a section from the verse, the first one, part of the inclusio, and then the second part. And then the verses in between them are what go together. Often we'll see inclusios at the beginning and ends of Psalms, like Psalm 8. O Yahweh, that's an apostrophe, by the way. O Yahweh, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And then he ends the poem in the same exact way. So that's an inclusio. He starts and ends. And that tells us a couple of things. One, it usually reveals that the theme, the focus of what's between those, the inclusio, and then also An inclusio function is like to mark out a particular stanza. Now, if it starts and ends the whole poem, then it's just focusing on the whole poem. So this poem, the focus is the majesty of God. All right. But sometimes, like Psalm 128 and Psalm 67, they have an inclusio inside of the psalm. And I showed you that example in class. You can go to your syllabus to identify that. And then rhetorical question. This is a question given where the answer is either it's not expected or that it's obvious. Who in the skies is comparable to the Lord? Well, we know the answer to that question. The author is not asking it because he doesn't know. All right. It's because he does know, and he's giving it in the form of a question for emphasis, for impact. But like if you think of like Mary in Luke 1, when the angel tells her that she's going to have a baby, and then she says, "How can this be since I'm still a virgin?" That wasn't a rhetorical question. She was really asking, like, how is that going to happen? I don't, I haven't known a man yet, so how am I going to be pregnant? So that wasn't rhetorical. Now, if she had said, "Who could ever have a baby like that?" Well, that would be rhetorical because she would be asking a question where she thinks she knows the answer. But that wasn't what she did. She was literally wondering how it was going to happen. Okay? So keep that in mind. When you see a question in a poem, don't assume it's rhetorical. Sometimes it's a legitimate question. But if it appears that the author knows the answer or he's not expecting an answer because it is obvious, then that would be rhetorical. Like Romans 8 or 6, sorry, when Paul says, when he's talking about grace, and then he says, "Shall we sin all the more so that grace may increase?" Well, he's obviously not suggesting we sin more. It's a rhetorical question. Of course not, right? And he even answers it, right? He says, "By no means, absolutely not." So, rhetorical question. Then finally, Salah. And we basically only see Salah in Psalms. All right. There's one example of it in Habakkuk 3 because Habakkuk 3 is written as a psalm. But Salah is used, that's specific to the poetic genre of psalms. And it's most scholars believe that it simply means to pause in the reading or the music in order to reflect on the statement that was just made. So here in Psalm 67, God be gracious to us and bless us and cause his face to shine upon us. And then he adds Selah, not for us to read, it's an instruction for the reader to pause. Or if there's music, for the music to pause so that we could think for a moment on what he just said. So when you see Salah um, like when you see Salah in a poem, in a psalm, then you should pause for a moment right after you read. You read the verse, and then if it says Salah, just pause just for a second or two, and then you can keep reading. I think that's the intent of that expression, Salah. Sometimes Salah can be marking out a stanza, but not usually. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit there. Let me see. Let me pull up. Do I have there, the devices. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to try to do here is we're going to look at Proverbs chapter 1 together. All right, and I'm going to see if you guys can we'll work together to identify these different the images and the poetic devices. So let me try to arrange this in a way we can do that. Okay. All right. So on the right here, I've tried to put all the devices we've been talking about here. So these are the figurative devices. These are the other poetic devices. So what we're going to do is let's read this section, Proverbs 1, 8 to 19, and then we will look and see if we can identify the images and then identify the poetic devices. All right. So with that, I'm going to ask you guys to help out with the reading here. Maybe if Yancey, if you could read 8 through 11, and then Jason, if you could read 12 to 15, and then Alan, if you could read 16 to 19. All right. So Yancey, if you're there, could you start us off and read verses 8 to 11?
Okay, verses 8 to 11. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without cause.
Verse 12. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. We will find all kinds of precious wealth. We will fill our houses with spoil. Throw in your lot with us. We shall all have one purse.
My 15 to 19. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path, for their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed blood. Indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird. But they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessors.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Well, here's what we're going to do. I'm just going to go through or discuss, let's mention the images. Unless you guys see any images here, I'll give you the first opportunity. Do you see any images here um, in the passage?
The graceful rape their head.
Yeah, good, right? He's described, oops, he's describing here, he says they're like a graceful wreath. All right. Verses 8 and 9. Right? It's the image of having a necklace, right? Or some decoration on the head and the neck. Maybe some kind of a headdress. And we might want to look at other passages that describe a wreath, if there are any ornaments, what those are. But we can at least, I think, tell it's some kind of a decoration being given. And so what will be the significance of that to the original audience? Uh, it seems to suggest maybe, right, having honor or being made beautiful or something like that. So we'd have to confirm that by looking at other passages which might use those. All right, so that'd be something to explore, but that's one image. What's another image here?
Uh,
Verse 11,
Yeah.
let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause. Continuing in verse 12.
Yeah, what's that picture? What's being described there?
just ambush.
Yeah, right, like a group of people waiting to attack, right? Some unsuspecting
Mhm.
person. Um, this would happen a lot, by the way, in that culture. That's why people, you wouldn't travel alone because you could be attacked, like we see in Judges, even with that Levite. I think it was a Levite, right? That his concubine, his companion, was attacked. So that's the picture here, right? These wicked men who are wanting to bring harm and violence. So he's describing a picture there. And then even from that, having what they steal, what they take from them, sort of a picture there, right? Of the spoil from these attacks. Um, right? How about 15 and 16? What's the picture there being described?
To be with like that, a company.
Yeah, right? This picture of following them and what they're doing. And then what you read, Alan, this kind of this picture of a baited net, right? A trap being set, but the bird isn't fooled because it sees the trap. Okay, so there's several images being expressed here. Okay, I think the first one may be the idea of a reward and blessing, right? This picture of a wreath and ornaments of someone being rewarded. So it's like when we listen to our parents' instruction and wisdom, then it's like receiving this reward. And the second image is oppression and violence. The third one is the satisfaction of right, somebody having their greed filled with, taking the spoils. And then this image, a warning, temptation. So each of these images present a different idea. They're all connected, but presents a different idea there. Okay. Well, let's now sort of look at, let's see, how can we do this? What I did here is I broke down into just a few verses each. Really, we can go a verse at a time and just identify the figurative language. And then I've got to the right here all the different figures of speech that we talked about. So let's see if we can identify the figurative language here in uh, verses 8, verse 8, and then verse 9. Does anybody see? Maybe I'll just start with Jay. Um, See if you can identify in the verse any figurative language. So just look at each line and say, okay, does this seem to be literal? Does the words mean exactly what he's saying? Or if not, then what figure of speech is he using? So as you look at the verse 8, do you see any figurative language here, Jay? And there may not be, all right? So don't assume there always is figurative language.
I think it's in indirect. It's not direct, Pastor.
So it's not literal, or what do you mean?
I'm not sure.
I mean, I think, listen, right? He says, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction." So, does he mean listen to your father's instruction? That seemed to be a literal statement. Or does he mean something else?
Yeah, yeah. I think the he means that's it's a direct. He means he listen. You listen to your father
Yeah,
instruction.
yeah. I think he's being literal here, right? Listen to what I'm telling you, your father's instruction, and don't forsake what your mother tells you. So I think here it's literal. I don't think there's any figure of speech on this one. All right. So because of that, Jay, how about verse 9? We'll give you one more. Do you see any figures of speech in verse 9? In other words, does he mean these literally, these statements?
No,
No, he doesn't, right? He's not saying that your father's instruction is a literal wreath on his head, right? So then what kind of figure of speech might this be? And you've got on the right here the different options. I mean, think about what is he doing here? What is the they?
it's a comparison.
Yes, very good. He's comparing to, right, the instruction and the teaching. And he says they, that instruction and teaching is compared to a graceful wreath. And remember, so it's a comparison. So it's one of these guys here. What kind of comparison is it?
Hypocatastasis, Pastor.
Yeah, that's the strongest one. But notice here, he says they are a graceful. And that would be if he had said they are like a graceful wreath, that would be a simile, right? But he says
Mm,
they are a graceful wreath. That's the next
metaphor.
metaphor. Yep. Now, if he had just said a graceful wreath to your head, that might be the hypo, but he doesn't say that. He says they are. So that's a metaphor. And then what about the next line? Again, there's an ellipsis here. They are the same thing, right? He's doing the same thing.
Yes.
Yep. You see that? It's another metaphor. They are ornaments about your neck. Okay. Of course, they're not literal ornaments, but he's making a comparison here. Okay, good. All right. Now, I'm going to ask you, verse 10. Do you see anything here? Any kind of figure of speech
It's
here?
literal.
Yeah, I think it's literal, right? Verse 10 is. How about verse 11?
Still literal, Pastor.
Literal.
Well, if they say let us lie in wait for blood, so does that mean they lie down and wait for literal blood to come?
Mm.
Hiding and
Yeah, I think that's an idiom, right? To lie in wait has this idea of an ambush, right? He says it literally in the next. statement, but to lie in wait means to be ready to ambush somebody or attack them, right? So I would call this an idiom, meaning to ambush. And that's exactly what he says in the next line. And even that word blood having the idea of wanting to do harm, violence. Okay, so he wasn't saying let's wait for some liquid, some blood to show up. It's this idea of let's ambush somebody, let's attack them, let's cause harm. Okay? All right. Let me ask Nigel here. Do verse 12.
All right.
You see anything
Let
there
us
in verse
swallow
12?
let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. Uh, there's an idiom there and also a simile.
Okay, so
The
what's
simile is the comparison between swallowing them alive and Sheol.
okay, good. See that word like there?
Okay,
Oops, if I
right.
could spell. Okay, and then you said there was also a
An idiom,
idiom.
uh, swallow them alive.
Yeah, he wasn't saying, they weren't saying, when we see this person, let's swallow them, literally, right? But it's this picture of, or description of what? What does that mean?
Let's take them. Let's
Yeah, surround, take, tack, right? Okay, good. Any other?
and even whole as those who go down to the pit. So another simile there.
Okay,
Yeah, a bit, comparing uh, the even whole, which is the way they would overtake them, comparing that with the fate of those who go down to the pit, with those who go down to the pit.
yeah. Okay, good. I'll just do that. Okay.
Mm, I'm I don't know if there's a hyperbole there. I'm not too sure about the hyperbole. Even whole, probably not. Probably
Probably not. Now, the pit, I think, might be a metonymy
not. All
for,
right. Okay.
all right. Remember, metonymy is one thing representing another, and here I think the pit represents, what do you think?
Sheol, death.
Yeah, death, the grave, or he calls it Sheol in the previous verse. Okay. So there's a few actually in just verse 12 here. All right, good. Very good. Okay, Alan, I'm going to give you verses 13 and 14 here. What do you see? Any figurative language?
We will find all kinds. We will fill our houses with spoil. Um, train your lot with us. We shall all have one verse.
Let's start verse 13. We will find all kinds of precious wealth. Do you think that's literal, or is there any figurative part to that, you think?
I think the first line is literal, and then the second line is not literal.
Okay,
We will.
what's figurative there?
Uh, Senate Duce.
No,
I don't
synecdoche.
was that synecdoche?
Okay, synecdoche means like one part representing the whole. So what would be the part representing the whole here?
Mm,
Or notice he says, we will fill our houses with spoil. You think he meant literally that the whole house would be full of the what they stole? Or is he exaggerating here?
it can be literal, and also I think it's also an exaggeration,
Yeah,
Pastor.
I think there's probably hyperbole here. Like he
Yeah.
didn't mean it would fill up his entire house with that they take, but there's a lot of it. And even maybe all kinds of precious wealth might be a little bit of hyperbole as well.
Hmm.
Because they probably won't get every possible kind of wealth, but just they're going to get a lot of it. So it seems like maybe some hyperbole here to emphasize that they're going to get a lot. How about verse 14?
Uh, I think it's also an exaggeration, hyperbole.
We shall all, this one?
Have oh yeah, we shall all have one course.
Yeah, it could be hyperbole. Um, it could be idiom, meaning like we'll all get like an equal share of the stolen things. How about throw in your lot with us?
Throw in your lot with us. Mhm.
Remember, lots to throw a lot was like throwing sticks or dice, like in a game of chance. Is that what he's telling them to do? Like, hey, play a game of chance with us? Or did it mean something else?
It means something else.
Yeah.
Throw meaning surrender. Throw in your lot with us.
Yeah, maybe
It's an
join us, right?
you know,
Um, it's kind of the idea.
so it's
Oh,
an idiom.
yeah, I think it'd be an idiom. Okay. All right, good. Yancey, why don't you try 15 and 16 here?
Yeah, verse 15, my son, do not walk in the way with them. In the way, I think that is the figurative means, which means a lifestyle.
Yeah,
In the way within
me
Indian, yeah.
go with them, live like them, something like that. Yeah.
And a second is keep your feet from the path.
What
Um,
might that be?
that is, I think it is a substitution.
For what? What would be substituted there? What kind?
It is that synaptic?
Yeah, good. Right, the feet. So we have synecdoche here, that tough one, synecdoche, right, where the feet represents the whole body, right? It wasn't just their feet that were going to go, right? The feet takes the whole body. So it's a part representing the whole. And then also too, I would say there's an idiom here, keeping your feet, right? Meaning right, meaning don't go. Okay? You guys see that, both of those? Okay, Yancey, how about verse 16? Anything there?
Yeah, yeah, for their feet run to evil. So feet
Same,
is the same, synecdoche,
same thing, yeah, synecdoche.
and also an idiom.
Okay, what's the idiom?
Um, run to evil.
All right, and what might that be referring to then?
It refers to one who is um, um, who can get easily do um, something evil,
Um,
meaning their intention, they have this intention to do something evil.
okay, and then even we see that in the next one, the shed blood,
Yeah,
right? Could be the idea of committing violence or murder. I might say that as a idiom. Okay. All right. Good. All right. Let's see. 17. Kind of a tough one. I mean, I think in one sense, he's meaning this in a figurative way, like it's like a proverb, don't spread the baited net in the sight of any bird, because then they'll see it. Um, so it's almost like a proverb. I don't know that it would be a figurative expression, but just sort of a proverbial statement. But then we come, oh, I didn't do 18 and 19. What happened to that? Let me come back up here and grab those. All right, I think, Nell, I don't think I gave you a chance here. You want to try verse 18? Is there any figures of speech there that you see?
But they are lying wait for your own bloody ambush on those.
We saw this one before.
Till I can wait.
Sorry?
Hypocastasis. Like in,
For lie in wait? Is that what you're asking?
yes, sorry.
Uh,
Sorry, exaggerate hyperbole for their
well,
own blood, they ambush your
yeah,
own.
remember, I think before we talked about this is an expression like an idiom, like meaning to ambush. So lie in wait was like as an idiom, means uh, to ambush, to do harm, something like that, which he repeats in the second line actually again. I think he set it up here. Yeah,
Verse
verse
14.
11. Let us lie in wait for
Yeah.
blood, ambush the innocent. So he's repeating that idea here, Dale. Um, and there's actually another, we haven't seen this yet. This one's a little tougher to see, but they lie in wait for their own blood, they ambush their own lives. If you read the whole flow of the poem, they were saying, right? Come, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent. And then Solomon says, but actually, they lie in wait for their own blood, they ambush their own lives. So, do you remember there was something we talked about here on this list over here where the statement made actually sort of means something the opposite to the people saying it. So they were saying, let's lie in wait for
Irony.
blood and ambush, but actually, this Solomon says they're actually going to be the problem's going to come on them. Does anything come to mind from over here what that might be describing? What kind of thing that is?
Irony.
Yeah, that's an
Asserting.
irony. Exactly. Right? Those who take life to gain wealth actually take away their own life. So that's the irony here. So you'd say like see verse 11, compare with verse 11. All right, good. Okay, and then I would say, so are the ways of everyone who, so that might be a form
Metaphor.
of a type of metaphor being described there. All right, good. I'll send you guys this. You'll have it actually in the assignment where, let me see if I can find this guy here. Oops, that's not it. Let me pull this up for a minute. Sorry, guys, give me a second to get this. There it is. Just pulling up the assignment. Here we go. All right. Okay, thank you for your patience. All right, here is assignment 318. All right, so I go through the 3 steps, identify the images, identify the figurative language, then identify the other poetic devices. Then here's the example. So this is all in the assignment. And then I have what we just discussed about the images and then the figures of speech or the figurative language within the poem. And then actually the poetic, the other poetic devices that are also there. We're not going to have time to go through that here, so I'll just point them out to you. You can study it more in detail in your in the assignment there itself. But if we look at the poem, notice I identified some of the repetition, the different colors there that we see in the poem. So notice my son, verse 8, my son, verse 10, my son, verse 15, which are also examples of apostrophe. There, notice he's addressing his son. My son, verse 8. My son, verse 10. My son, verse 15. That's apostrophe, direct address. And then notice we also have interjection here in verse 17. Indeed. See that? Indeed, it is useless. That's an interjection that he's making. There's no refrain here, no repeated verse or phrase that he gives. We do have an ellipsis, verse 9. Remember I showed you before, and they are ornaments about your neck. So that's ellipsis, right? And then Let's see if there's any other. No inclusio, no rhetorical questions, and then no Salah. We won't see Salah in the Proverbs anyway. Okay? So, so you have this example from Proverbs on both the figures of speech that we just covered together, and then the other poetic devices. And now what you're going to do is essentially now take your assigned Proverbs passage and do the same three steps. Identify the images, identify the figurative language, and then the other poetic devices. Okay? And I'll have in the notes that I send you, I'll give you that summary that I showed here, the this one. So you'll have this summary. I'll put that in your notes, okay? So you can have that with you as a reference, or you can go back to the syllabus, and it has the this as well. I don't remember what page it's on, but you can go back to the syllabus, okay? All right. Whew. We covered quite a bit there. So this assignment, is might take you a little longer just because of those figures of speech. Those are a little more challenging to remember or use. But the more you do this, the more you try to identify, the easier it is you'll be to see what's in there. And again, these figures of speech or these poetic devices simply guide and direct us to what the author's doing. All right. So he's using personification here to draw attention to some particular thing, or he's using an idiom here just to express something in a more poetic or picturesque or image. Like he could have just said, when someone tells you to go and harm another person, don't do it. Solomon could have said that here, but instead he says, if someone says, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush. So it's a more poetic, emotional, picturesque expression. Because then later he wants to say, actually, they are lying in wait for their own blood and they're ambushing themselves. And so expressing it in this poetic way adds more emotion or emphasis to it. So it might seem like this assignment is just kind of detail and, how's this really going to help? But really want to be able to spot one, to look to see is using figurative language, because what we don't want to do is you don't want to identify something as literal when it's figurative. And you don't want to identify something figurative when it's literal. For example, in John 6, when Jesus said, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood," there are some who have interpreted that literally. The people listening to Jesus interpreted it literally. That's why they walked away. They thought Jesus was crazy. And now there's even in the Catholic Church today, in the Mass, they interpret that passage literally, that the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ that we consume. That's a very dangerous and wrong interpretation, because they interpreted something that was figurative, they interpreted it as literal. So we don't want to do that. And we don't want to do the opposite, interpreting something that's literal as figurative. Okay? So it's important. We have to recognize when it's literal or figurative language being used. And there are many today who read, especially the Old Testament, and they look at prophecies or things there and they say, oh, that's figurative, that's spiritual. Israel really isn't going to inherit the land. That is the church now. And so they're interpreting something literal as figurative. We can't do that. So that's why this is an important assignment. And it's important when you study poetry, especially poetry, that you're able to identify what is literal, what is figurative. when we get to the prophetic books in the next module, you'll see the prophets use poetic language. And so that's why some misinterpret. They say, oh, that's figurative when it's actually literal, or sometimes they say that's literal when it's actually figurative. And so we need to understand the difference and to spot and see. So if we say it's figurative, you have to say, okay, how is it figurative? What is the figure of speech being used? You have to be able to identify it. If you can't, then maybe it's not figurative. Maybe it's literal. Okay? So that's why this assignment is important to do. Okay, questions, comments before we end our time together this morning.
Pastor Tim, a question relating to
Yes.
this assignment and preaching.
Yes.
So the expectation is that as we preach these poetic genres, for example, there's an illustration in our a poetic language in our text. We're supposed to state the truth and then even explain how the image highlights the truth.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Like if you're describing the ornaments, right, and the wreath, you'll say, no, notice here. So for example, right, when we just went through, right? And he says in verse 9, right? They are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. So you might say, so after Solomon gives the exhortation to his son to listen to their instruction as parents, the wisdom they are receiving. Notice he then describes the um, why that's important by using a picture here. Notice the picture. He says, a graceful wreath to your head, ornaments about your neck. What's he describing here? Well, he's comparing this wisdom, following the wisdom of your parents is what that will produce. And then you just explain, graceful wreath, ornaments, either that idea of a reward or beauty or something like that, as you're studying those expressions. And so then you'll explain the connection.
Mm.
Right? You don't have to use
All
the
right.
term metaphor, or you can if you want, but it's really more of he's now presenting an image here
Mm.
that describes really the result of listening to wisdom. And this is what it
All
will
right.
produce. This is what it will be like. This is how you will benefit from it.
All right.
Okay?
And that's a sub question to that. Since
Yes.
we're already explaining the truth with this, it's an illustration, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
the
an
image is an illustration.
illustration. Sorry?
All right. Does it still warrant using a real life illustration from time to time, or will that be redundant in your experience?
I think here it would be redundant unless you really feel like you need to emphasize the point.
Okay. All
Or
right.
sometimes the biblical illustration may not be as clear because it's more removed. So you might
Mm.
want to also explain the biblical illustration, but then you might want to include a contemporary one
Mm. Okay.
to help, because sometimes the illustration won't make as much sense to us because we're not the original audience.
Mm. Okay.
So the impact of it may not be as strong as you might need to use a contemporary modern illustration to help them understand the idea or impact of this illustration of this Solomon. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Pastor Dan.
Yeah, great question.
Um, Tim, just one quick question. So
Yes.
the way we teach poetry is it in deductive or inductive way?
Ah, another good question. Well, poetry is, remember, normally for direct instruction, we would do a deductive sermon where we state the main idea up front and then show it as we go through the text. A narrative or an indirect instruction we would do inductively, like in a story. So poetry is generally direct instruction. Now it's figurative, but it's still direct, right? Hear, my son, your father's instruction. He's making a direct statement here. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. Then he illustrates why that's important. And then he gives sort of this picture or example of, being enticed to do evil and don't go with them. So this is direct instruction. Now he's using metaphors and idioms and things like that. But because it's direct instruction, you're going to want to teach it deductively. Right. So the theme of this, we'll cover this in the future sessions, right? But the theme of this, might be the idea of, the importance or value of wisdom or something like that. And then you'll show in the poem how the author expresses the value or importance of wisdom.
Okay. Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Okay. So yeah, deductive in this case. So yeah, as you guys are putting together your sermons for your Psalms text and your Proverbs text, um, do like you did for the epistle, where you present your main point, uh, in the introduction at the beginning, and you repeat that main point as you go through, and then each stanza will be an outline point that should connect to the main point, which we'll see the example from Proverbs in future sessions, but yeah, preach it similar to the epistle, except in this case, you're going to have more poetic language, more, imagery, things like that that you're going to add to it that because it's poetic. Epistles are more straightforward. Um, Poems have some, figurative language and images and things you'll need to be explaining as well. All right, very good. Any other questions or comments before we finish today? Okay, well then I'm going to ask if Jason could go ahead and close us in prayer.